Jake Monroe had always been the type of man to plan ahead. A creature of habit, he believed in working hard and reaping the rewards. At 32, he had accomplished everything he thought he ever wanted. He had a high-paying job at a prestigious marketing firm, an apartment in the heart of New York City, and an almost perfect fiancée. The life he had built with Sarah, the woman he was about to marry in a few short weeks, seemed like the epitome of success. The kind of life most people only dreamed about. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. Jake stood in his office, his sharp suit a testament to his years of dedication. He watched the bustling city below from his glass window, the skyscrapers reaching toward the heavens, as if to mirror his ambitions. The world seemed to bow at his feet, and he couldn't help but think how lucky he was to have it all. It was 3 p.m., just another day at the office, and yet Jake felt a strange unease settle in his chest. The contract with a new client was finalized, the numbers were good, and his boss had praised him for his contributions. Everything was going smoothly, but a thought nagged at him. Sarah had been acting distant lately. At first, Jake chalked it up to wedding stress after all. Planning a wedding was no small feat, but the longer it went on, the more he noticed the small things. The way she'd become distracted when he spoke, the rare smiles that never reached her eyes, the way she started texting more often when they were together. At first, he dismissed these signs as mere coincidences. After all, she was busy too, dealing with wedding arrangements, dealing with her family. Her career life had a way of piling up, didn't it? But the unease wouldn't go away. This wasn't like Sarah, the woman who had been the center of his world for the last 5 years, the woman he had shared every dream, every milestone with, the woman he was about to spend the rest of his life with. He brushed off the feeling as best as he could and dialed her number. "Hey, babe," he said, trying to sound casual, though a hint of anxiety leaked through. "Hey, you," she replied, her voice soft but distant. "You okay?" he asked, not quite sure why he was asking. It just felt necessary, like a moment of connection was slipping through his fingers. "I'm fine, just tired," she answered quickly. He could almost hear her typing something in the background. He wondered if she was texting someone else. He shook his head at the thought, willing himself to stop. "Want to do something tonight?" he asked, trying to push the nagging feeling aside. "A quiet dinner? Just the two of us before the craziness of the wedding kicks in?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line before she answered, "I'm not sure. I've got a few things to take care of, but I'll see." It was a small thing, but Jake's stomach tightened. "Okay, well, I'll be home at 7. We can talk then." "Sure," she said. It was the same routine they had followed for weeks. Casual, unremarkable, but today it felt like an abyss between them. As the clock ticked, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He tried to focus on work, but the images of Sarah distracted him, her face, her body, the way she used to look at him like he was the only man in the world. But now it felt different, as if an invisible wall had quietly been built between them, one that was growing higher with every passing day. When Jake got home that evening, he decided he would surprise Sarah. He had planned the wedding for months. He'd paid attention to every detail, yet he hadn't paid enough attention to her. He wanted to make things right, to remind her that he was here, that they were here. He grabbed a bottle of her favorite wine and some takeout from their favorite restaurant. He wasn't expecting anything extravagant, but he wanted to take her away from the wedding stress, away from everything else. They needed to reconnect. The apartment was eerily quiet when Jake entered, the familiar smell of Sarah's lavender perfume mixing with the crisp night air. He set the takeout on the kitchen counter and walked into the living room. Sarah was there, sitting on the couch, her back to him, typing away on her phone. She didn't even acknowledge him when he walked in. He cleared his throat softly. "Hey, babe, I brought dinner. I thought we could." She looked up from her phone, her eyes briefly meeting his, but there was no warmth, no spark, just a vague flicker of something he couldn't read. Her lips were tight, her posture stiff. "Hey," she said, forcing a smile. The air between them felt cold. Something was off, and Jake felt it deep in his gut. He walked over to her, setting the wine on the coffee table. "Sarah, what's going on?" His voice was gentle but firm. He had to ask. He couldn't keep ignoring the tension in the room any longer. Her face fell, and for a split second, Jake saw something like guilt flash in her eyes before she quickly masked it. "Jake, we need to talk." The word sent a cold shiver down his spine. He had heard those words before, in other relationships, in other places. But hearing them now, from Sarah, it was as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes welled up with tears, but she didn't cry. Instead, she took a deep breath and said the words that would change everything. "I've been seeing someone else." Jake stood frozen, his body going numb as he tried to comprehend what she was saying. His heart was hammering in his chest. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All he could do was stare at her, his mind racing. The words didn't make sense. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. "Who?" he croaked, trying to keep his voice steady, though the tremor in it was unmistakable. "Matt," she whispered, and that single word hit Jake like a punch to the gut. His best friend. His business partner. The man he trusted most in the world. Everything inside Jake shattered. The silence between them was deafening. His mind was a swirl of confusion, rage, disbelief. He had trusted Sarah with everything. She was the woman he had planned to marry. They had built a life together, or so he thought. And now, here she was, admitting that she had been seeing his best friend behind his back. "How long?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse. "Months," she replied softly. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I was lost, and Matt, he was there. He understood me." Jake's fists clenched, his mind screaming at him to understand, but nothing made sense. This was his reality now betrayed by the two people he loved most. The foundation of his life was crumbling around him, and all he could do was stand there, frozen in shock. "I thought I was the one who could make you happy," he muttered, his words barely audible. "I'm so sorry, Jake. I never wanted to hurt you," Sarah said, her voice trembling. But Jake wasn't listening. The pain was too much. He turned and walked out of the apartment, stepping into the cold New York night, as the life he had once known slipped through his fingers. Jake had never felt the kind of emptiness that surrounded him now. He wasn't sure if it was the silence of the apartment, or the realization that everything he had worked for, everything he had trusted, had been completely dismantled in the span of a few minutes. The cold air of the New York night didn't seem to touch him. He was numb-lost somewhere between disbelief and an overwhelming urge to scream. As Jake wandered through the streets of the city, his mind raced. How could this have happened? How could Sarah, the woman he was about to marry, betray him with Matt, his best friend, his business partner? His hands were clenched in fists, his body rigid with anger and confusion. The city around him, the one he had known so well, felt foreign. The lights that had once been comforting now seemed cold and distant. He couldn't go back to the apartment. He couldn't face the reality of it all. He couldn't look at the place that once felt like home, a space he had shared with Sarah. He wasn't ready to confront her again, to deal with the 1,000 questions that were racing through his mind. So, he walked. He didn't know where he was going, didn't care. The city was sprawling, endless, and so full of people, yet at that moment, he had never felt more alone. The streets were busy, full of people who seemed to have their lives in order, who weren't stuck in this moment of personal devastation. And then, he thought of Matt. His mind immediately went to the memories, the countless nights they spent together, their plans for the future, how they'd supported each other through every success and failure. Matt, the man who had been his closest confidant, the one he had trusted with everything. Now, he felt like a stranger. How had he not seen the signs? How had he missed the obvious? How long had they been lying to me? Jake's thoughts spiraled out of control, and before he knew it, he found himself standing outside a bar, the neon lights flickering in front of him. He had no intention of going in, no real desire to drink or socialize, but something about the place felt like a refuge. Inside, the chatter and music blended into the background, as Jake sat down at the bar, ordering a drink he barely tasted. As he sipped the whiskey, he couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. Every time he closed his eyes, all he could see was Sarah's face, her apology, the tears in her eyes, and then the image of Mathis' best friend. How could this happen? He stared into his glass, lost in thought, when a voice broke through the fog of his mind. "Jake?" Jake turned, surprised to see his brother, Ben, standing at the end of the bar, looking both concerned and relieved. Ben had always been there for him, and despite everything, seeing him now felt like a lifeline in the middle of a storm. "Ben," Jake muttered, his voice hoarse. "What are you doing here?" "I should ask you the same thing," Ben said, sliding into the seat next to him. "You disappeared. I tried calling you, but you didn't pick up. I figured you might need someone to talk to." Ben gave him a long look, one that was both sympathetic and understanding. Jake took another sip of his drink, trying to compose himself. I don't know where to start," Ben sighed. "I'm sorry, Jake. I know things have been hard with Sarah. I've been worried about you, but I thought maybe you'd want to talk." Jake couldn't bring himself to look at Ben. His thoughts were still tangled in the mess of what had happened, And no matter how hard he tried, it all came crashing down again: the betrayal, the lies, the fact that Matt, of all people, had been the one to destroy his life. "I caught her," Jake said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "She admitted it. She's been with Matt for months. Behind my back. I thought she was the one. I thought I knew her. But I didn't. I didn't know any of this." Ben's face softened with empathy. "You're in shock, Jake. You don't have to figure everything out right now." "I don't know how to even begin to fix this," Jake replied, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. "I feel like everything I've built has just crumbled. I can't go back. I can't face her, and I can't face him. What the hell do I do now?" Ben reached out, placing a hand on his brother's shoulder. "You take it one step at a time, Jake. You don't have to have all the answers right now. This is a huge betrayal, and I'm not going to lie, it's going to take time. But you've got me. You've got Mom and Dad, and we'll be here for you no matter what." Jake nodded, the tears threatening to fall, but he couldn't bring himself to cry. Not here, not in front of Ben, he thought. The idea of crying felt so foreign now. He had spent so much of his life suppressing his emotions, thinking that success and achievement were the answers to everything. But now, all those achievements felt hollow. Nothing mattered. The only thing that felt real was the anger, the hurt, the betrayal, the hollow emptiness that weighed down on him every moment. "I don't know what to do about Matt," Jake said, his voice shaking. "He's been my best friend for years. He was there when I started the company. He was there when I proposed to Sarah. How could he do this to me? How could I not see it?" Ben shook his head slowly, his expression pained. "I don't know, Jake. I wish I could explain it. But what matters now is what you do next. You can't control what happened, but you can control how you move forward." Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands. He was angry, but more than that, he was hurt. He wasn't sure what the future held. His life, once full of certainty, now felt like a house of cards ready to fall at any moment. The thought of confronting Sarah or Matt filled him with dread. He couldn't face either of them yet, not when the betrayal was so raw. But Ben was right, couldn't stay in this place forever. "I need to get out of here," Jake muttered, looking up at Ben, his eyes still clouded with grief. "I can't stay in this apartment. It's all too much." Ben nodded. "I've got a place in Brooklyn. You can crash there for a while. We'll figure it out. You don't need to be alone in all of this." Jake considered Ben's offer, feeling a flicker of relief at the thought of a change of scenery, away from the place where everything had fallen apart. Maybe, just maybe, this could be the start of something new. Or maybe it would just give him the time and space he needed to process everything. Either way, he couldn't stay in his old life. Not yet. "Thanks," Jake said quietly, his voice rough. "I appreciate it, Ben. I don't know what I would do without you right now." Ben smiled softly, his expression gentle. "You've got me, Jake, and you'll get through this. It'll be hard, but you'll get through it." The days after Jake moved into Ben's apartment felt like a slow descent into an unfamiliar world. He had traded the chaotic, fast-paced life he had spent years building in Manhattan for a quieter, slower existence in Brooklyn, but the transition wasn't easy. It was as if he had woken up in a different life, a life that didn't feel like his own. His mind constantly raced between flashbacks of Sarah's tear-stained face and Matt's distant, apologetic gaze. Jake knew he had to find a way to cope, to rebuild, but the weight of everything that had happened was crushing. The apartment Ben had offered him was small but cozy, tucked away in a corner of Brooklyn that felt worlds away from the life he had known. It was an old building, full of character, the floors creaking with every step, the windows offering a view of trees and the occasional jogger, a far cry from the high-rise apartment in Manhattan where he had imagined his future. He spent the first few days in a haze, mindlessly scrolling through emails, checking work messages, and trying to focus on anything but the aching void that had replaced his heart. His phone had stopped buzzing with messages from Sarah, the ones that once made him feel wanted, connected, and important. Now, there were only a few sympathetic texts from friends, some of whom he hadn't heard from in years. And there was Ben, always present, always understanding, but Jake couldn't help but feel like a burden. How could he keep leaning on his brother for support? Wasn't it time to start fixing this? Fixing himself? On the fourth morning, Ben insisted that Jake get out of the apartment. "You can't stay here forever," he said, his voice gentle but insistent. "It's time to get some fresh air. You need to do something." Jake had barely left the apartment since the day Sarah told him everything. Every time he thought about leaving, the weight of it all would sink in again: the betrayal, the lies, the shattered future. But Ben was right. He couldn't hide from it forever. And as much as he wanted to stay cocooned in his grief, the world was still turning. He couldn't stop it. They walked to a nearby cafe, one Ben frequented when he needed to get away from his own writing. It was a small, quiet place with a narrow wooden door, the kind of cafe that didn't draw much attention. It was the perfect spot to begin to step back into life. The place was relatively empty, save for a few patrons hunched over their laptops, focused on their own work. The atmosphere was warm, with the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. Jake sat down at a small table near the window, his eyes automatically drifting to the people outside. Everyone seemed to be in motion, living their lives, while he sat frozen, unsure of what the next step was. "Jake," Ben said, his voice quieter this time. "You can't keep doing this. You have to start again. You can't let them take this from you." Jake looked at his brother, his face a mix of confusion and sorrow. "How do I even start? Where do I go from here? The future I imagined is gone. My life is in pieces, and I don't know how to put it back together." Ben sighed and leaned forward, his voice full of concern. "You don't have to fix it all right now. Take it one step at a time. Start small. Start with the things you love. Reconnect with what makes you. You." Jake felt a pang in his chest as he thought about the man he used to be. The man who had dreams, ambition, and a sense of direction. The man who believed that everything would fall into place as long as he worked hard enough. The man who had looked at Sarah and believed she was everything he needed. Now, that man seemed like a stranger. How could he go back to that? "I don't even know what I love anymore, Ben," Jake admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent so much time focused on work, on the wedding, on her. I don't know who I am without all that." Ben looked at him for a long time, his gaze thoughtful. "I get that. You've been living for other people for so long. Maybe now is the time to live for yourself." The words hit Jake harder than he expected. Live for yourself. It sounded simple, but the implications were profound. He had always been a people pleaser, constantly striving to meet the expectations of those around him, his parents, his fiancée, his colleagues. His career had been his identity, and Sarah had been his world. But now, he was left standing in the rubble, unsure of who he even was without all of that. "Start small," Ben said, as if reading his thoughts. "Maybe take up something you used to enjoy. Maybe hit the gym, take a walk, try something new. It doesn't have to be huge." Jake nodded slowly, the weight of those words sinking in. He had always liked staying active. He used to play basketball in college, go for long runs to clear his mind, but in the years leading up to the wedding, he had neglected that side of himself. He had traded physical well-being for work and planning. He had pushed everything else aside. "I'll think about it," Jake said, though it was more of a promise to himself than anything. He didn't know how he was going to rebuild, but he had to try. He couldn't keep sitting in Ben's apartment letting his anger and sadness rule his life. That afternoon, Jake decided to take a walk through Brooklyn. The air was crisp, and as he walked, he found himself drawn toward the water. There was a park that ran along the East River with a view of Manhattan's skyline, and something about it called to him. He used to come here to think, years ago, when life seemed simpler. He sat on one of the benches overlooking the river, watching the boats glide by. The skyline looked distant from this vantage point, as if it belonged to another life. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to block out the noise in his head, the images of Sarah and Matt, the pain of betrayal, the broken promises. And when he opened them again, the world seemed a little clearer. For the first time in days, Jake allowed himself to feel the moment. The cool air, the sound of the waves, the seagulls flying overhead. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He didn't have all the answers yet. He wasn't fixed. But for a few minutes, he could just be. As he stood up to leave, he felt a small flicker of hope faint. But there, he had taken the first step. And that, for now, was enough. Jake woke up to the soft, golden light, streaming through the window of Ben's apartment. The sky was a pale blue, the distant sound of the city just audible from this quieter part of Brooklyn. For the first time in weeks, Jake felt something other than the crushing weight of betrayal. It wasn't joy he wasn't there yet, but it was a subtle shift. He wasn't sure what it was, but something inside of him had started to stir. Maybe it was the way the sunlight filtered in, the first light of a new day. Or maybe it was the simple fact that he was still here, still breathing, still moving forward despite the chaos that had consumed his life. He had spent the last few days drifting through his new routine, a routine he hadn't asked for, but that had been imposed upon him after Sarah's betrayal and the destruction of his life as he knew it. Ben had been supportive, making sure Jake didn't stay locked inside all day, convincing him to take baby steps to rebuild his life. It wasn't easy, but Ben's constant presence had become a comfort. Still, Jake felt the ache deep in his chest, the remnants of the life that had slipped through his fingers. It was impossible to ignore the feeling of lost the vision of his future, the trust he had placed in Sarah and Matt now gone. He was left to pick up the pieces. The night before, Ben had insisted that Jake start doing something physical. "You've been through a lot," Ben had said. "But if you want to heal, you need to get your body moving. It'll help you clear your mind, even if it doesn't feel like it right now." Jake had been hesitant at first. The thought of putting himself through something that required effort seemed like an impossible task when the emotional toll of the betrayal still felt so raw. But Ben was persistent, and after some back and forth, Jake reluctantly agreed to give it a try. That morning, he found himself standing in front of a small boxing gym in the neighborhood, the sign hanging crookedly over the entrance. It wasn't glamorous, nothing like the expensive gyms he had been a member of in Manhattan. It was gritty, full of the kind of energy that could either break him or build him back up. The moment Jake stepped inside, he was greeted by the smell of leather, sweat, and something that reminded him of a distant past. A sense of relief washed over him. He knew he needed to channel his emotions into something physical, something that could take him out of his head, even if just for an hour. The first few rounds on the punching bag felt awkward. He was stiff, unsure of his movements. His punches were weak, his body resistant to the effort. But there was something freeing about it. For the first time in weeks, Jake allowed himself to focus on something that wasn't heartbreak. With each punch, he released the anger that had built up over the past few months. His betrayal, his heartbreak, the endless loops of thoughts about Sarah and Matalovit started to get quieter. Each strike felt like a step away from the emotional paralysis that had held him captive. The trainer, Tony, was a burly man with a no-nonsense attitude, but there was something in his eyes that told Jake he had seen his fair share of people walk through those doors, looking for something to fix them. "Focus on the bag," Tony said as Jake jabbed and crossed, his fists landing with more power than before. "Don't just hit it. Make it hit back. Make it feel like it's your world, not theirs." Jake didn't know why, but those words hit him in a way nothing else had. He wasn't just punching to release his anger. He was punching to take control, to claim a small piece of his life back. There was a rhythm to it that felt more familiar than he expected. His muscles began to work in unison with his mind, his body working to release the thoughts that had been suffocating him. The sting in his knuckles didn't matter anymore. The ache in his arms was nothing compared to the emotional weight he'd been carrying. He had to keep moving forward. This, he thought, was a small way to start. By the time the session ended, Jake was exhausted, his body sore. His muscles stretched in ways he hadn't felt in years. Sweat soaked through his t-shirt, and the physical exhaustion was welcome. As he walked out of the gym, the world didn't seem so daunting. It wasn't that his problems had disappeared, but for the first time in a while, he felt like he had control. Even if it was only for a moment, the weight on his shoulders had lifted, just a little. That evening, Ben suggested they go for a walk around the neighborhood. Brooklyn had a different pace than Manhattan's lower, more deliberate. It felt like the kind of place Jake could come to terms with his past. The narrow streets, the old brick buildings, and the quiet parks provided an escape, a contrast to the chaos that had unfolded in his life. As they walked side by side, Ben nudged Jake, breaking the silence. "You know, it's okay to be angry. It's okay to want to destroy something when everything feels like it's falling apart. But you can't stay there forever. You have to figure out what you want next." Jake looked over at his brother. Ben's face was calm, his eyes filled with understanding. But there was a steeliness to his words. "How do I do that?" Jake asked, the question more about life than the immediate future. "You start with what you know," Ben said, his voice steady. "What do you love, Jake? What brings you peace? Think about it." The question hit him harder than Jake expected. What did he love? He had spent so much of his life focused on building his career, on pleasing Sarah, on planning the life they had envisioned together, that he had forgotten what made him happy. For a long time, he had only chased external validation. Now, faced with the reality that everything he had built was gone, he didn't know where to turn. "I used to love basketball," Jake said quietly, more to himself than to Ben. "I used to love playing, running up and down the court, but I haven't touched a ball in years." Ben smiled slightly. "There you go. You have to find those things again, Jake. You can't spend all your time looking back at what you lost. There's still a lot in front of you." The next day, Jake signed up for a local basketball league. It wasn't much, just a weekend pickup game, but it was a start. For the first time since everything fell apart, Jake felt a little spark of excitement. He wasn't sure if it would fix anything, but it was something to look forward to. It was a reminder that life still held moments of joy, even in the aftermath of his pain. As the days turned into weeks, Jake slowly began to build a new life. His days were filled with boxing and basketball, quiet walks through Brooklyn, and working on his consulting business. Slowly but surely, he began to remember who he was before Sarah, before Matt, before the betrayal. He wasn't just the man who had been wronged. He was a man who could rebuild, who could take control of his own narrative. The road ahead was uncertain, and he wasn't sure when or if he'd ever truly heal. But Jake had learned one thing in the last few weeks. Healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant finding a way to live with the past, to move forward despite it. And for the first time in a long while, he was ready to face the future. The weeks passed, and Jake began to find a rhythm. Each day felt like a slow reclamation of his own life. The constant ache that had gnawed at him in the beginning began to lessen, even if it was just a little bit each day. There were fleeting moments when he could feel the weight of his past lifting. Not gone entirely, but easier to carry. His mornings had started to feel more grounded, and the evenings, though still quiet, held a sense of peace that was absent before. Jake's boxing sessions had become a ritual, something he no longer dreaded but looked forward to. His body had grown accustomed to the strain, his punches sharper, his movements more fluid. It wasn't just about getting stronger physically. It was about regaining control over his life, about redirecting the anger and pain that had been eating at him into something productive. He had learned to use his body as a way to process emotions that had previously overwhelmed him. Still, Jake knew he couldn't stay in this place forever. As much as he appreciated Ben's support, he wasn't sure how much longer he could lean on him. Ben had been a constant, but Jake wasn't ready to make his brother his crutch. Ben's suggestion to reconnect with old hobbies had been a lifeline, but now it was time to focus on the future. Jake couldn't keep running from the reality of his situation. The emotional rebuilding had to coincide with practical action. Jake had always been ambitious, and although he had spent much of his life dedicated to his corporate career, he knew deep down that he had a passion for helping others. For years, he had dreamed of using his knowledge to help smaller businesses navigate the financial world. The corporate grind, though rewarding in some respects, had never truly satisfied him. The idea of starting his own consulting firm had been something he had tucked away, always put off for later. Well, now it was later, and the time felt right. On a rainy Wednesday afternoon, Jake sat down at Ben's kitchen table, a mug of coffee in front of him, a laptop open to a blank page. He had spent the last few days looking into what it would take to start a business, the ins and outs of a consulting firm, the challenges that awaited him. It felt daunting, but it also felt exciting. This wasn't just about work, it was about forging a new path, creating something of his own. He typed out the first sentence of what would become the foundation of his business plan. My consulting firm will provide financial guidance to small businesses, focusing on sustainability, growth, and long-term success. The words came easily, flowing as if they had been waiting to be written. The familiar feeling of ambition, the one he had almost forgotten, settled back into his chest. This was something he could control. This was something that could bring him joy again. But it wasn't just the business that was on his mind. Jake knew that moving forward in his personal life was just as important. He had shut himself off emotionally for so long, and though he wasn't ready to jump into another relationship, he couldn't deny that there was a part of him that was beginning to crave connection. In the weeks that had passed since Sarah's betrayal, Jake had taken time for himself, focusing on healing. He had thrown himself into physical activity, business plans, and reconnecting with old hobbies, but it was time to consider the next step. One Friday evening, after an exhausting work session at the library and a much-needed workout, Jake found himself walking through a neighborhood bar in Brooklyn. It wasn't his usual scene, but something about it felt welcoming. It was one of those quiet spots that didn't feel the need to advertise itself, the kind of place you found by word of mouth, dimly lit, with a jukebox playing soft tunes in the background, and a handful of regulars chatting quietly at the bar. Jake sat down at a corner table, ordered a beer, and allowed himself to relax for the first time in what felt like forever. He wasn't thinking about Sarah. He wasn't thinking about Matt. He wasn't thinking about the wreckage of his life. He was just being. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Mind if I join you? A voice interrupted his thoughts. Jake looked up, surprised to find a woman standing by his table. She was tall, with dark hair pulled back into a neat bun, wearing a leather jacket and a smile that felt genuine. Sure, Jake said, motioning to the empty seat across from him. I don't mind. The woman sat down with a casual grace, folding her arms over the table. I saw you sitting here by yourself and thought maybe you could use some company. I'm Leah, she said, offering her hand. Jake, he replied, shaking her hand. There was something easy about Leah's presence, something disarming. It felt like a breath of fresh air. They exchanged pleasantries, and soon the conversation flowed naturally. Leah wasn't in a rush. She wasn't pushing anything. She was just there, in the moment. As they talked, Jake realized something he hadn't expected to feel. He was enjoying himself. The attraction was there, yes, but more than that, there was an ease between them that he hadn't experienced in a long time. They talked about music, books, their favorite places in Brooklyn, and even shared stories about the ups and downs of life. For the first time since his world had shattered, Jake didn't feel burdened by his past. After a few drinks, Leah looked at Jake and said, You seem like you've been through a lot, but there's something different about you tonight. I don't know what it is, but you seem lighter. Jake wasn't sure how to respond to that. He hadn't been light in weeks. He had felt heavy, burdened by everything that had happened. But tonight, he felt a little less weighed down. I guess I'm starting to figure things out, he said, surprised by his own words. Leah smiled. Good. I think you're going to be just fine. For the first time in a long time, Jake believed her. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Jake continued to work on his business plan, meeting with potential clients, and laying the groundwork for his consulting firm. His sessions at the boxing gym grew more intense, and he found himself waking up earlier each day, more determined than ever to push himself physically and mentally. The fog that had once clouded his mind began to dissipate, and while the past wasn't gone, it no longer consumed him. One afternoon, as Jake sat in a coffee shop reviewing his client proposals, he received a text from Leah. I'm free this weekend. Want to grab coffee and talk business? Jake smiled, a genuine smile that felt unfamiliar but good. He wasn't sure where this would go, but he wasn't running from it. He had been running for too long. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, he felt ready to open himself up again, even if it was just a small step forward. He texted back, Sounds great. Looking forward to it. The weeks that followed marked a turning point in Jake's life. His consulting business, which had initially felt like an abstract idea on paper, was beginning to take shape in the real world. It hadn't been easy. There were setbacks, delays, and plenty of doubts that crept in as he worked through the logistics, reached out to potential clients, and built his network from the ground up. But as each small success stacked up, Jake began to realize something important. He was capable of this. He had always been good at navigating the corporate world, learning the ins and outs of strategy, marketing, and financial planning. But now, doing it on his own terms, without the safety net of his old firm, was exhilarating. It was also terrifying. There were moments when the fear of failure loomed large, especially in the quiet nights when he would lie awake thinking about the future. But he didn't let that fear consume him anymore. With each new client, each new project, Jake learned to trust himself. He was, after all, building something from the ground up, something that was his. His meetings with Leah, once a simple coffee date, had evolved into something deeper. She had become a consistent presence in his life, not just as a potential business partner, but as someone who understood the complex layers of his world. It wasn't easy for Jake to open up. He had learned that the hard way in the past, but Leah had a way of making him feel safe. She didn't push him to talk about things he wasn't ready to, but she didn't shy away when he did. They spoke about their careers, their aspirations, and, as time passed, more personal topics. Jake started to feel comfortable with the idea of allowing someone else in, though he still carried the scars from his previous relationship. Leah had suggested almost casually that they attend a small networking event one Friday evening. It wasn't something Jake had anticipated, but the idea of meeting other entrepreneurs and like-minded individuals intrigued him. He hadn't been to any events like that in years, certainly not since his relationship with Sarah had taken all of his focus. They arrived at the event, a cozy venue with dim lighting, soft jazz music in the background, and an array of professionals milling about. Jake immediately felt out of place's suit, felt stiff, his movements clumsy as he adjusted to the social environment. But Leah, ever the calm presence, placed a reassuring hand on his arm. You'll do fine, she said softly, her smile warm. You've got this. And, for the first time in a while, Jake believed her. They spent the evening meeting people, exchanging ideas, and talking about their businesses. It wasn't long before Jake found himself chatting with an entrepreneur who had just launched a successful tech startup. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and Jake found himself more animated than he had been in a long time. For the first time, he felt that old fire return, the same fire he had felt when he started his first job in the corporate world, when everything was new and exciting. Later in the evening, as the event began to wind down, Jake and Leah found a quiet corner to sit. He had made several valuable connections and even scheduled a follow-up meeting with a potential client. But it wasn't just the professional success that made Jake feel a sense of accomplishment. It was the fact that he had enjoyed the experience. He hadn't felt out of place. For once, the idea of talking business, of forging new partnerships, didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a possibility. "I'm glad you pushed me to come here," Jake said, taking a sip of his wine. "I wasn't sure at first, but this felt good." Leah smiled, her eyes twinkling. "I knew you'd be great. You've been carrying this weight around for so long, Jake. Maybe it's time to let some of it go." The words hit him harder than he expected. It was true. He had been so focused on building a future that he had forgotten to live in the moment. He had been so consumed with the idea of fixing what was broken that he had ignored the simple joy of creating something new, something entirely his own. As the night wore on, Leah and Jake found themselves walking along the streets of Brooklyn, the lights from the event still buzzing in the background, but now muted by the cool night air. The conversation shifted from business to something lighter, and Jake found himself laughing, genuinely enjoying the simplicity of the moment. He hadn't realized how much he had missed a conversation that didn't revolve around pain, guilt, or loss. It was in this moment, walking down the quiet streets, that Jake realized something significant. His life, though scarred, was not over. It was just beginning. The following weeks were filled with the ebb and flow of work and personal growth. Jake continued to meet with clients, each interaction building his confidence a little more. He had been skeptical about starting his own business at first, but now he saw it as a way to create something of substance, something real. His clients were small business owners, individuals who were trying to make a mark in their industries just as he was. They trusted him, and that was something he hadn't felt in a long time. Trust, both given and earned. At night, he and Leah continued to spend time together, their connection growing deeper with each passing week. They had dinner, went to art galleries, and took long walks through the city. For Jake, these moments were both soothing and invigorating. He had forgotten how much joy could be found in simply being with someone who understood you without judgment. One night, over dinner at a small Italian restaurant in the city, Leah looked at him with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said, "I think you're ready for the next step." Jake raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" She smiled, setting down her wine glass. "I've watched you grow so much since we first met. I can see it in the way you talk about your business now. You're not running from your past anymore. You're embracing it. And I think you're ready to take on whatever comes next, whether that's growing your business or whatever life throws at you." Jake was silent for a moment, processing her words. He didn't know if he was ready for everything that was coming. There was still so much about himself, about the future, that felt uncertain. But what he did know was that for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was walking in the right direction. He had healed in ways he hadn't expected. And as much as the scars from his past would always be there, they no longer defined him. He had learned to see them as a part of his story, not the whole of it. "I think I'm ready too," he said finally, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks for being patient with me." Leah reached across the table, her hand warm and steady in his. "You don't have to thank me. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." For the first time in a while, Jake felt the weight of his past lift just a little. He was ready for the next chapter, both in his career and in his personal life. And with Leah by his side, he knew the future didn't have to be so daunting. The future, he realized, was full of possibilities. Jake woke up that morning with a sense of purpose that felt different from before. The previous months had been a whirlwind of pain, rebuilding, and unexpected growth. But today was different. It wasn't just about putting the pieces back together. It was about taking the pieces of his life and shaping them into something new, something he was in full control of. The sun was shining, casting long shadows across the streets of Brooklyn, and for the first time in a long while, Jake felt a surge of energy. He had spent the last few weeks growing his consulting business, working tirelessly to make his vision a reality. The hard work was paying off, and he could see his goals taking shape. He had secured several client small businesses that needed financial guidance, and each one was a step forward in proving to himself that he was capable of more than just surviving. He could thrive. Leah had been right about him all along. The journey he had taken wasn't just about moving past the pain, it was about embracing it, learning from it, and finding a way to live with it. He had started with boxing to release his anger, reading to reconnect with who he used to be, and now his business was flourishing. There were days when Jake still found himself missing Sarah or questioning the paths he had taken, but those days were fewer. They were no longer the only narrative of his life. They were part of it, yes, but no longer in control of it. He sat at his kitchen table, sipping his coffee, staring at the stack of papers and financial reports that had been neatly organized in front of him. Today, he was meeting a potential new client in upscale cafe, looking to expand into other cities. The opportunity felt like it could be a breakthrough, one that could elevate his reputation even further. He had worked hard for this chance, and he wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers. Ben had given him one final piece of advice that had stuck with him. Jake, you're not just a consultant now, you're a leader. You need to start seeing yourself as one. You've got the skill, the vision now. You just need the confidence to lead. Jake had taken those words to heart. He wasn't just the guy who had been betrayed, the man who had watched his life unravel. He was a businessman. He was an entrepreneur. He was someone who had worked for everything he had, and now he could trust himself to take it further. The meeting that afternoon was exactly what he had hoped for. The cafe owner, a woman named Carla, was impressed with Jake's insights into their financial strategy. She had been struggling to take her cafe beyond the local scene, and Jake had a plan. They talked for over an hour, discussing expansion, logistics, and the challenges of keeping a business profitable in a competitive market. By the end of the meeting, Jake had secured a contract to help guide the cafe through their next phase of growth. As he shook Carla's hand, he couldn't suppress the smile that spread across his face. This was real. This was happening. His business was taking off, and with it, a sense of pride he hadn't felt in a long time. Later that evening, Leah and Jake met for dinner. As usual, Leah greeted him with a warm smile, and Jake felt a spark of connection that had only deepened with time. Their relationship had evolved into something more than just casual dates and small conversations. There was a trust between them now, a shared understanding that neither of them had been quick to give away. "You look like you're in a good mood," Leah remarked as Jake sat down across from her, a broad smile still lingering on his lips. "What happened today?" Jake leaned back in his chair, his fingers tracing the edge of his wine glass. "I just signed a contract with a new client this cafe that wants to expand. It's a big deal for me." Leah's eyes lit up with excitement. "That's amazing, Jake. I knew you could do it. I'm so proud of you." Jake felt a warmth spread through him at her words. He had never been good at accepting praise, always deflecting it. But tonight, for some reason, it felt different. He didn't have to deflect. He had worked for this moment, and he had earned it. "Thanks, Leah. Really. I couldn't have gotten this far without your support. You've been here when I didn't even know how to pick myself up." He reached across the table, his hand resting gently on hers. "I'm grateful for you, more than you know." Leah's smile softened, and she squeezed his hand. "I'm just glad I could be part of your journey, Jake. You've come a long way, and I think you're just getting started." That night, as they walked along the Brooklyn Bridge, the city lights reflecting off the water below, Jake found himself in a quiet moment of reflection. The past few months had been a storm of emotions, decisions, and rebuilding. He had feared he would never emerge from the fog of pain and anger. But now, standing here with Leah, in the warmth of a city that still felt unfamiliar in many ways, Jake realized how far he had come. It wasn't just about business. It wasn't just about success. It was about the choices he had made to keep moving forward, despite the setbacks, despite the heartbreak. He had chosen to rebuild, to trust himself again, and to open himself up to new opportunities. And in that moment, he felt the weight of it, all the weight of his past, his failures, his losses, but it didn't feel as heavy anymore. It was a part of him, not the definition of him. The following week saw Jake diving deeper into his consulting business, taking on bigger projects, and setting even higher goals for himself. His work was thriving, and with every new client, his confidence grew. He began speaking at small business events, offering advice on financial strategy and helping entrepreneurs understand the complexities of their business models. His expertise was sought after, and he realized that, just like Leah had said, he wasn't just a consultant anymore, he was a leader. People were looking to him for answers, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he had them. It wasn't always easy. There were still days when the ghost of his past threatened to resurface. There were still moments of doubt, especially when things didn't go as planned. But he had learned how to manage the uncertainty. He had learned how to trust his instincts, how to move through the doubt, and how to keep pushing forward. With each passing day, he found that the past had less and less power over him. One night, after a particularly challenging client meeting, Jake walked into his apartment, his mind racing with ideas and strategies. He wasn't ready to rest. He had work to do. But as he opened the door, he found Leah sitting on his couch, a book in hand. She looked up at him, her eyes soft, and in that moment, Jake felt a sense of peace he hadn't expected. "You're still working?" Leah asked with a gentle smile. Jake sighed, walking over to the couch and sitting next to her. "I can't help it. There's always something to be done." Leah leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "You don't always have to work, Jake. You've earned the rest, too." Jake smiled and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the stillness of the moment wash over him. Leah was right. It was time to find balance, to work hard, but also to live, to love, and to enjoy the journey. As he sat there, with Leah by his side, Jake realized that this was the beginning of something new, something beautiful, not just professionally, but personally as well. He had faced the storm, weathered the pain, and now he was ready for whatever came next. And for the first time, in a long time, Jake felt like he was truly living. The past had shaped him, yes, but it didn't define him. The future was wide open, full of possibility. Jake was feeling the weight of his success, but this time it wasn't overwhelming. It was different from the pressures of the past. It was the kind of weight he had earned, the kind that reminded him that he had made something of himself. His consulting business was thriving, and the clients were coming in faster than he had anticipated. The cafe project he had helped launch was growing, and word of mouth about his expertise had spread like wildfire through small business circles. People were starting to trust him not just with their financial plans, but with the future of their companies. But success brought its own set of challenges. The more clients he took on, the more hours he spent away from the life he was slowly beginning to build. The balance between work and personal life, something that had once seemed like an easy concept, was now a delicate tightrope. He had promised himself that he wouldn't let his business consume him the way it had before, but the lines between work and personal life had begun to blur. Jake was, for the first time, not just working for a paycheck, he was building something meaningful, something entirely his own. It was an intoxicating feeling, one that left him hungry for more. He had learned to deal with the unpredictability of entrepreneurship. There were always highs and lows, but now it was starting to take its toll. Some nights, Jake found himself staying up late, poring over spreadsheets and business plans, only to wake up early the next morning to answer emails and prepare for the next meeting. His physical workouts at the gym, once his escape, had become shorter and less frequent. His time with Leah, who had been a steady presence throughout all of this, had become scarce. They would meet for dinner when they could, but even then, it was often overshadowed by his constant need to check his phone or respond to emails. Jake knew he had to make a change. He had promised himself that he wouldn't make the same mistakes again. He wouldn't let work consume him, especially not after everything he had been through. But it was easier said than done. He had always been driven, always been the kind of person who needed to be ahead of the curve, who needed to prove himself. But now he was beginning to realize that the cost of that drive was more than just hours spent in the office. Leah noticed it first. They had planned a quiet dinner at a new Italian restaurant in the city, one she had been raving about for weeks. It was the kind of place where the staff knew your name, and where you felt like you were eating in someone's home rather than a restaurant. Jake had promised that tonight would be different. No work talk, no checking emails, just a night for them. But the moment they sat down at their table, Jake's phone buzzed. It was a message from one of his clients, a last-minute change to a proposal he had submitted earlier that day. He didn't even hesitate. He picked up his phone and started typing out a response. Leah watched him for a moment, then cleared her throat. "Jake," she said gently, "I thought we agreed we wouldn't talk about work tonight." Jake looked up from his phone, a mix of guilt and frustration crossing his face. "I know. I'm sorry. I just need to finish this, and then I'll put it away." Leah smiled, but it wasn't the warm smile Jake was used to. It was softer, more resigned. "Jake, it's not just about tonight. It's about how often this happens. I get that your business is growing, that you're in demand, but I don't want to feel like I'm second to your clients all the time." Jake felt a pang of guilt shoot through him. He had been so caught up in the whirlwind of his work that he hadn't even noticed how much he was pulling away from her. "I'm sorry, Leah. I didn't realize how much it was affecting you." Leah sighed, her eyes softening. "It's not just about you not being present. It's about you being so wrapped up in the future that you forget about right now. You're not living in the moment anymore. You're living in the next thing, the next project, the next meeting, and I don't know if you even realize it. Jake stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He had been living in the future for so long, chasing after the next success, the next milestone. But in doing so, he had been missing out on the present, on the moments that mattered, the ones with Leah, the ones with his friends, the ones that made life worth living. I've been so focused on my business and proving myself, he admitted quietly, his voice strained. I've been so focused on making sure everything goes right that I've forgotten about the people who matter the most. Leah reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. Jake, you've built something incredible, but I don't want to lose you to it. You don't have to be perfect, and you don't have to prove anything. But you do have to be present. You have to be here, with me, with yourself. Jake nodded, the realization settling over him like a heavy fog. He had been so afraid of losing everything again, so afraid that his success would slip away, that he had forgotten the most important lesson of all. Success wasn't just about the numbers, the clients, or the accolades. It was about the people who helped you along the way, the relationships you nurtured, and the balance you found between work and life. The dinner passed in a more comfortable silence, the kind of quiet that comes when two people understand each other. Jake put his phone away and made a promise to himself and to Leah that he wouldn't let work overshadow their relationship. He couldn't afford to lose sight of what really mattered. The next few days were filled with difficult decisions. Jake knew that he couldn't keep up the pace he had been running at. He had to reevaluate his schedule, prioritize his health, and set boundaries with his clients. He couldn't be available 24/7 anymore. It wasn't healthy, and it wasn't sustainable. He sat down at his desk the next morning, a fresh cup of coffee in hand, and began drafting a new schedule for himself. He would work hard, but he would also take time to focus on himself, on his physical health, his relationships, and the things that brought him joy outside of business. He would set specific work hours and stick to them. He would make time for Leah, for his family, for his friends. Jake's first step was small but significant. He took the weekend off to spend time with Leah. They went for a hike upstate, taking in the fresh air and the beauty of nature, something Jake had missed for far too long. As they walked, Jake felt a sense of freedom, not from his business, but from the constant pressure he had been putting on himself. He had always been driven by the need to succeed, but now, for the first time, he realized that success wasn't just about climbing the ladder. It was about finding balance, about living in the moment, about cherishing the people who made life worthwhile. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Jake took Leah's hand and smiled. "Thank you for being patient with me," he said. "I've been lost in the hustle, and I forgot what really matters." Leah squeezed his hand, her eyes warm with affection. "I'm glad you're here, Jake. With me, right now." And for the first time in a long time, Jake didn't feel like he had to prove anything. He didn't need to be perfect. He didn't need to have all the answers. He just needed to be present. And with Leah by his side, he was ready for whatever the future held. The next few months felt like a new chapter in Jake's life. There was a noticeable shift in how he approached both his business and his personal life. The intensity that had once consumed him had mellowed, replaced by a steady sense of purpose and balance. He had learned to set clear boundaries, and though it was challenging at times, Jake had committed to living with intention, something he had never done before. Leah noticed the change too. She no longer saw the constant distraction in his eyes or the endless emails that had once dominated their time together. Instead, Jake had begun to invest more in the present, focusing on her, on his work, and on himself. He still ran his consulting business, but now it felt like a part of his life, not his entire life. That Friday evening, as Jake closed his laptop after a productive but contained workday, he felt an overwhelming sense of satisfaction. His inbox had been cleared, his tasks completed, and he had carved out time to meet with a few close friends for dinner, something he hadn't done in months. It was a far cry from the days when work had consumed him, keeping him tethered to his desk long after the sun had set. He stood up, stretched, and smiled to himself. He felt different. He was different. And for the first time in years, Jake felt like he was living his life, not just surviving it. Leah had been a steady source of support through this transition. She understood the pull of ambition, the drive to achieve more, but she also knew the importance of finding peace in the process. She had become Jake's anchor, someone who didn't just stand by him, but someone who actively helped him grow and challenged him when he needed it. Jake had learned to be more present with her. They spent weekends hiking, cooking together, and talking about their dreams and fears. They still had their individual goals, but they were also learning how to grow together. It wasn't perfect. There were moments when Jake still found himself slipping back into old habits, losing track of time as he worked late into the night. But he had come a long way. That particular evening, Leah was waiting for him at their favorite restaurant, a quaint little bistro tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. Jake hadn't seen her in a few days, as he had been caught up in the final stages of a big project with one of his clients. But he made a promise to himself that tonight would be about them, not work. He walked into the restaurant, and there she was, sitting at their usual table by the window. Leah looked up and smiled, the warmth in her expression making Jake's heart beat a little faster. He walked over to her, leaning down to kiss her on the cheek before sitting across from her. "Hey you," Jake said, smiling back at her. "I missed you." Leah's eyes softened. "I missed you too. How's work been?" Jake leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "Busy, but in a good way. I'm getting better at managing it, though. I'm learning to take it slow and not let it consume me." "That's good to hear," Leah said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "You've been so focused lately, but it's nice to see you more balanced. You're here, with me, right now. I appreciate that." Jake felt a rush of gratitude in that moment. He had struggled so much with finding balance before, with feeling like he had to prove something to the world. But now, with Leah by his side, he realized that it was okay to slow down, to not always be chasing the next thing. What he had, right here, was enough. They ordered their food, and the evening passed with easy conversation, laughter, and quiet moments. For Jake, it was a reminder that life wasn't just about what you accomplished. It was about who you shared it with. And tonight, with Leah, he was reminded of that truth in a way he hadn't been in years. The next few weeks brought more growth for Jake, both personally and professionally. His business continued to thrive, but now he felt more in control of it. He was taking on larger clients, speaking at small business seminars, and gaining recognition in the industry. He had even started mentoring a few young entrepreneurs, passing on the lessons he had learned the hard way. But it wasn't just about work anymore. Jake had made an effort to reconnect with his friends, some of whom he had distanced himself from during his intense focus on business. He realized how much he had missed their company, their laughter, and their grounding presence. They had been there for him before the success, before the betrayals, and before everything that had come crashing down. Now, they were part of the new chapter of his life where he was learning to be more present, more open, and more vulnerable. One afternoon, after a client meeting, Jake received a text from his old college roommate, Mike, asking if he wanted to meet up for a drink. Mike had been a constant throughout Jake's life, someone who had been through thick and thin with him. Though they had drifted apart after college, their bond had never truly faded. Jake smiled at the message, eager to reconnect. It was another step forward, another piece of his life falling into place. They met at a bar in the city, one that was familiar to both of them. Mike was already there, sitting at the bar, a beer in hand, his usual mischievous grin on his face. "There he is," Mike said, standing up to give Jake a hug. "The man who conquered the consulting world. You look different, man, more relaxed, somehow." Jake laughed, feeling the weight of Mike's words settle in. "Yeah, I guess I am. Took me a while to figure it out, but I'm getting there." Mike gestured for him to sit down. "So, tell me everything. I heard you've been crushing it with your business, and I see you're spending time with Leah more, huh?" Jake nodded. "Yeah, things have changed. I'm learning how to juggle it all. Not just work, but life. Leah's been great through all of this. I've realized I need more than just career success. I need balance. And I've started rebuilding that." Mike raised his glass. "To balance. I always thought you'd be too driven to slow down, but I'm proud of you, man. You're finally getting it right." They spent the next few hours reminiscing about college days, catching up on life, and talking about their respective careers. It felt good to reconnect, to know that even in the midst of everything Jake had been through, he still had these roots, these friendships, that kept him grounded. As the evening wound down, Jake found himself walking back to Leah's apartment, his heart light. It wasn't about the success or the recognition. It was about the people he loved, the relationships that sustained him through everything. And Leah, who had been by his side from the beginning of this journey, was at the center of it all. That night, as they sat on the couch together, Leah leaned her head on his shoulder. "You've come so far, Jake. I'm proud of you." Jake smiled, his arm wrapping around her. "I couldn't have done it without you. You've helped me see what really matters, and for that, I'm grateful." They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the world no longer pressing on Jake's chest. He was exactly where he needed to be. And for the first time in a long time, he realized that the future wasn't something to chase, it was something to live. Jake stood by the window, watching the sun set over the skyline of Manhattan. The city had always been a part of him, its energy, its fast pace, its constant hum of life. But in this moment, as he gazed out over the horizon, Jake felt a deep sense of peace. The past few months had been transformative, not just in terms of his career, but in every aspect of his life. He had started his consulting business, rebuilt his relationships, and perhaps most importantly, he had learned to live with his scars, not as something to hide or suppress, but as part of his story. He had come a long way from the broken man who had walked out of his apartment that fateful day, when Sarah's betrayal had shattered everything. He remembered the pain of that moment, the way it had felt like the world was collapsing beneath him. But now, standing here, Jake could see how far he had come. It wasn't just the success of his business, or the growing number of clients, though, that was important, but the way he had reclaimed his life, his joy, and his sense of self. Jake had learned that life was about more than just ambition, and success wasn't just measured in business achievements. It was about balance, about finding happiness in the small things, about nurturing the relationships that mattered most. It was about being present. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Leah. "Dinner at 7 tonight? I'm cooking your favorite." Jake smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. Leah had been his rock throughout all of this, but she had also been a mirror, showing him who he could become when he allowed himself to be vulnerable, when he allowed himself to trust again. Their relationship had deepened over time, not just because of their shared experiences, but because they had learned to support each other in the best and worst of times. They had weathered the storms together, and Jake knew that whatever came next, they would face it side by side. The last few months had been about rediscovery for both of them. They had taken their time, not rushing into anything, but allowing their connection to grow naturally. Jake had learned to be more present with her, to listen, to communicate. He had learned that being in a relationship wasn't just about being there physically, it was about being there emotionally, offering support and care, and receiving it in return. Leah had been patient with him, understanding that he needed time to heal from his past. But now, Jake felt ready for the next step. He had been thinking about it for a while, knowing deep down that this was where he was supposed to be. It wasn't just about being with Leah. It was about sharing a life with her, building something lasting and meaningful. He wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't afraid of commitment, of opening up, of trusting again. He had already learned that the key to living fully was to embrace both the light and the dark, the joy and the pain. Dinner that night was everything Jake had hoped for. Leah had made his favorite pasta dish, the one they had shared on one of their first dates. The table was set, the soft glow of candles filling the room with warmth. As they sat down to eat, the world outside seemed distant, irrelevant. It was just them, here, in the quiet of their home. "I have something to ask you," Jake said, his voice steady, but his heart beating a little faster than usual. Leah looked up, her expression soft and curious. "What is it?" Jake paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for, even though he hadn't realized it until now. "Leah, I've spent so much of my life focused on the wrong things. I've been so consumed with work, with proving myself, that I lost sight of what really mattered. And in doing that, I lost sight of the people I love, including you. But you've been there for me through it all. You've helped me rebuild, and now I want to ask you something that's been on my mind for a while." Leah's eyes softened, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. She set her fork down and reached for his hand. "Jake, you don't have to do this, you know. I'm here with you, no matter what." "I know," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "But I want you to know that I'm ready to build a future with you, to create something real, something lasting. Not just a business, but a life we share. Leah, will you move in with me?" The words hung in the air between them, filled with both uncertainty and hope. It was a big step, a leap into the unknown, but Jake knew that this was the right time, the right person. Leah didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at him with a mixture of surprise and affection. Then, she smiled, her eyes shining with warmth. "Of course I will. I've always wanted that, Jake. But more than anything, I want you. You've already shown me how much you've grown, how much you've learned. And I'm here, right here, every step of the way." Jake felt his heart swell with emotion. The weight of everything he had been through, all the pain and heartbreak, had led him to this moment where he could finally breathe freely, knowing that the person sitting across from him was someone who truly understood him. They weren't perfect, but they were real. And that, Jake realized, was enough. In the weeks that followed, Jake and Leah began the process of merging their lives. It wasn't just about moving in together. It was about creating a space for their relationship to flourish, about finding a new rhythm that balanced their careers, their passions, and their love for each other. Jake continued to grow his business, taking on bigger projects and expanding his client base. But now he had a team he could rely on, a group of people who shared his vision and helped him navigate the demands of entrepreneurship. He no longer had to carry the weight of everything on his shoulders. Leah had continued her own work, and though she hadn't expected to, she found herself increasingly involved in Jake's business. She was a natural, offering advice and support that helped him refine his strategies and vision. They started talking about future plans, not just in terms of business, but in terms of their life, together travel, adventure, family. For the first time, Jake allowed himself to imagine a future without the constant pressure to succeed, without the fear that his past would repeat itself. He wasn't running from his past anymore. He had accepted it. He had embraced it. As Jake sat in their new apartment, looking at the life they had started to build together, he realized how far he had come. The man who had walked out of his apartment all those months ago, broken and lost, was no longer the man staring at the sunset today. He had healed, he had grown, and he had found a path, forward a path, filled with both uncertainty and hope. But for the first time, in a long time, Jake wasn't afraid of the future. He was ready for it. Whatever came next, he knew he was no longer walking alone.